the video for this week. And this week, we didn't have a book read. So you get a film. Also, I was looking for an excuse to rewatch this film because I really, really like it, but I think 5 times in 6 months without a good excuse is too many times. So we are talking about the 1928 Universal film, The Man Who Laughs. Okay, but before we start, remember there is our shop where there are books and there are writing services. There is our Redbubble shop where there is over 100 designs. A lot of them silent film related, a lot of Buster Keaton stuff. So if you want to support us, try either of those places. If you want to support us but don't want to spend any money, that is entirely fine. I fully respect that. Like, subscribe, comment, and share. Those things really, really help us. So, this week we are having a look at The Man Who Laughs, which is a 1928 adaptation of the Victor Hugo novel of the same name. In English, it's called The Man Who Laughs, or in French, Le Homme qui rit, The Man Who Laughs. And this is a film and a novel that is set in England, in spite of it being a French writer. Set in England in the very, very late 17th and the very, very early 18th centuries. But this is the time period. It's that very transition-y period. Sort of the fun of the Restoration has ended. James has completely messed up, and Anne is on the throne, and they're about to get Georges in because we've run out of English aristocracy who can take the throne without causing another big problem. So let's bring in the Georges, which is the majority of the 18th century is under the Georgian rule. But this is the very early part of the 18th century. So, what's the story? Now, I talked about this one briefly in the Buster Keaton to German Expressionism video. And so all of the silent ones in that are going to get their own video. This one's the first of that. So that was in that video because it really does help you in your transition into German Expressionist film. Because it's a little bit hard to classify this film. So it's the story of the book and the film, they deviate quite a bit, is that a rebellious nobleman has defied King James, who is a tyrant. I think King James was just an idiot. He managed to screw it up, like a lot of the Stuarts managed to screw things up, but that's a whole other thing. I think he was very much more his father's son, and his father lost his head. So I don't actually know quite why he was so intent on the Catholic side of things when his brother had just sort of finally calmed everything down. But there you go. So Gwynplaine's father, who is played by Conrad Veidt also, has defied the king, but he's come back to England because he's been searching for his son. His son has actually been taken and sold to a group called the Compancheros. Now, they don't exist historically. They are something that Victor Hugo made up. These are basically a vagrant group who surgically alter children to turn them into beggars. What has happened to the Lord Chanticleer's son is he has been had a grin carved into his face and has been sold to these people. It's pretty ghoulish. It's really pretty ghoulish, the setup to this story. A few years later, which actually Victor Hugo clearly didn't know English history, because he has this happening in 1790. 1790 is when the Battle of the Boyne happened, which was James II's attempt to regain his throne. I did start looking into this because I am that kind of nerd. That was when the Battle of the Boyne happened. It failed because, of course, it failed. Otherwise, English history would be quite different. So I don't think he was really declaring proclamations. I believe 1790 is actually William and Mary period. So this whole the whole story of this is completely fictional, because Victor Hugo didn't really care about the historicism of his novels. So anyway, the Compincheros are banished from England, and they leave Gwynplaine, as he is now known, on the docks. Gwynplaine wanders around the snow and comes across a woman and a baby. The woman is frozen to death, but the baby is still alive. They are then taken in by an old philosopher who is called Ursus. And he brings these two children up as he discovers that the little baby is blind from having been out in the cold and the snow, and sees Gwynplaine's face. And so he takes pity on these poor children and brings them up. And they're brought up as strolling players. So that's sort of the setup for this story. Gwynplaine and Dea, who the little girl is known as, are very much in love, but Gwynplaine cannot bear anyone. He really hates people seeing his face. He hates being laughed at, and yet that's how he's able to make money. That's the only way he's able to make money, because the minute people see his face, people laugh at him. Now, this film gets it sits in a really weird position because it's a Carl Laemmle film, it's a Universal film, and it gets sort of smushed in with the Universal monsters, which it kind of isn't. The role of Gwynplaine was originally intended for Lon Chaney, and Lon Chaney had already played the Phantom of the Opera, and he'd already played the Hunchback of Notre Dame. He was known for his big makeup performances. I watched the Phantom of the Opera, or I watched some of the Phantom of the Opera because I got bored, because Lon Chaney is not the most charismatic actor. He is somebody who lets the makeup do the work, not him. Mary Philbin who plays Dea, is in this, The Man Who Laughs, because she had been in the last big hit, which was the Phantom of the Opera. Some of the sets from the Hunchback of Notre Dame were reused in this. This was a film that they put a lot of money into. It's Hollywood. But they couldn't get Lon Chaney for this, so they turned instead to Conrad Veidt, who had been brought over for a John Barrymore film. Now, Conrad Veidt didn't speak a lot of English, and then they put dentures into his mouth with hooks that gave him the grin. It's a really simple effect, but it's really effective. It really distorts his face. So he can only act from this up, which is, you would think is quite inhibiting. But Buster Keaton does an awful lot from here up too. And that was what I thought when I first saw the film. I watched this because it was late in the afternoon. I had had wisdom teeth out. I was still sort of dealing with all of that, and I had builders in my backyard. I was not in a great mood when I first watched this film, but I watched it. It's like about 2 hours long, and I really got into it. And part of the reason I really got into it was Conrad Veidt, because he's acting from here up, and he acts with his body. And being someone who likes Buster Keaton, I was like, oh wow, he's doing something very similar to what Buster Keaton is doing, acting wise. So that was what made me look at the film. The other thing that gives this film its look is the director, which is Paul Lenny, who is the director of Waxworks. So Veidt and Lenny had already worked together in Germany in Waxworks, and Conrad Veidt's bit of Waxworks is like the best part of Waxworks. We will do Waxworks at a later date. So I was really attracted to this film because of the performance. That's usually what drags me into a film. Once I find an actor, I then go and hunt out other things. So that was what did it for me. A lot of people comment on the fact that Paul Lenny brought German expressionist elements to the film. Those elements are really at the beginning of the film, that you see them with the Iron Maiden or the Iron Lady. You see them with the Gibbet, but you don't see them that much further in. Mostly further in. This is not a German expressionist film. It has elements of that style, but they don't last very long. It's also not a horror film. That's where this gets really messed up. It sort of doesn't fit places. It's not a horror film. It's a sentiment. It's very sentimental. It's a melodrama. It's a romance. It's got swashbuckling elements to it, but it's not really a horror film, unless you want to say that a man who's had his face disfigured is a monster. And that's where that becomes really, really interesting with people's reaction to this, because I have heard it called a horror film. I have heard Gwynplaine referred to as the monster. And I think that says an awful lot more about the viewer than about the film itself. The really interesting woman in this is the Duchess Josiana. Now, she was a Russian actress. I'm Olga, and I'm not going to attempt her last name. I'll put it up on the screen. She was a Russian actress who also, Veidt and her wanted to work together. And they have a seduction scene where she attempts to seduce Gwynplaine. But you start to say, oh yeah, she's a much stronger actress than Mary Philbin is. She has, I think, roughly similar screen time, but she's definitely a villain. Getting back to why I have problems with this being called a horror is, you can't call Gwynplaine a monster. He has when your monster has panic attacks, like 3 different panic attacks because people are laughing at him, he doesn't turn violent. He literally has panic attacks. I don't think that's the monster. The monsters are not the ones who look like monsters, which is kind of the point, that it's very much in line with Victor Hugo. Victor Hugo's does this a lot, because you see this in The Hunchback of Notre Dame. Victor Hugo is a writer who I find kind of... he has angels and devils, and that's about it. And I find that a little bit lack of nuance, a little bit dull. But Gwynplaine is supposed to be one of the angels. He's not a villain. He's not a monster. Monsters are Josiana as a monster. Barkilphedro, who is the king's jester, he is one of the monsters. He really is the one, he and Josiana do push this. Barkilphedro in particular. Barkilphedro is the one who sold Gwynplaine to the Comancheros, and he is also the one who orchestrates the arrest and the elevation to the peerage of Gwynplaine. And so, to humiliate the Duchess Josiana. He does this to humiliate her. There are other really interesting little characters, like Dirimois, the Duchess's fiance. The moment of him, he's an idiot, but he's a good idiot. Like, he's an idiot. He's a pampered, luxurious aristocrat, but he's not cruel. Which makes him quite an interesting. A more interesting little minor character. There are all these little characters in there. Ursus is played by an Italian actor. And that's another thing that I really loved about this is it's kind of like an opera where you've got these big you've got an international cast. Yes, it's a Hollywood film, but you've got a German lead actor, you've got a Russian antagonist, you've got an Italian actor in a support role. I think that's really a fascinating thing about this. But I also think, definitely for me, the center of this film is Conrad Veidt's performance, because what he is able to bring out in this character is how incredibly isolated being disfigured has made him. People have said, oh, the story's really, really slim because Gwynplaine loves Dea, Dea loves Gwynplaine, but Gwynplaine won't marry her, and that this seems a little bit arbitrary. But it's the performance that makes you realise that he has been laughed at his entire life. There has not been a single moment, which is part of the reason why he's actually susceptible to the Duchess Josiana, is no one has ever looked at him without laughing in his face. The idea that a woman would desire him looking like this has never happened. I mean, being a teenager is hard. Being a teenager is hard. You know, it doesn't matter which gender. You want to look your best. You look possibly the worst you'll ever look. It really is hard. And then put onto that also the fact that his face has been disfigured. Yeah, you're beginning to understand why this man has such self-worth that is somewhere below the gutter. He's only able to make a living by presenting himself to be laughed at. This is how he can support what his adopted family is by allowing people to laugh at him. The only times that he is actually genuinely happy or comfortable is when he's with Dea, and because she can't see him. And he, unlike in the book, she has touched his face and she assumes that he's always happy because he's always laughing, which is very much they're paper doll characters, really. Which makes them the book very unsatisfying because they are paper doll characters. Whereas for the film, he will not let her touch his mouth. He will not let her touch it because he fears the one little bright spark in his life will leave him when she sees that, when she sees what he looks like. Because he's old enough to already have a knowledge of the reaction of people seeing him when he finds her. So this is one person in the world who is not going to recoil or not going to laugh at him. Ursus doesn't either, but Ursus is a father figure to him. So, that's a different sort of relationship. He's an intelligent, sensitive man who no one can see that because they can't see past this. Is what makes that how he finally reacts after the third panic attack in the House of Lords so important, because that's the point. It's less the moment where he allows Dea to see him and she doesn't recoil. It's less that after Josiana has laughed at him, but actually the point at the House of Lords where he protests, where he actually, because until then he's still very timid, he's very easily led, he does as he is told. He doesn't have that sense of saying, of being able to direct his life. He is, as he always has been, as he has always known, at the whims of other people, whether it's the compancheros, whether it's Ursus who's said, okay, well, this is how you earn your living, whether it's the audiences who demand this, whether it's someone else has always done. And then at this point is the point where he actively makes a choice. He actively makes a choice, and it is, it's very, well, the Elephant Man is very, very reminiscent of this. In the Elephant Man, and I think this film reminds me very much of the Elephant Man, which I also watched recently. I watched this and then I watched the Elephant Man, but that when the Elephant Man is cornered in the train station, I think it's actually in the men's lavatories by the audience, and he yells at them, I am not an animal, I am a human being. It's very much an echo of what Gwynplaine says in the House of Lords, asserting his humanity, because that is the thing that has been stripped out of him. Until now, he has seen himself as a clown, as something else, as something not quite human, not deserving of full humanity, which includes the woman, marriage to the woman he loves. But it's in the House of Lords that he actually finally asserts his humanity. He says, no, I'm a man. And that's really the climax of the film. That's the big thing. And that is the thing that allows him to then be able to have that life. Unlike the book, I don't like the ending of the book. It is overly melodramatic. It is overly sentimental, and I think it really shows a dearth of imagination for Victor Hugo, because whereas the film allows the disfigured man and the disabled girl to literally sail off into the sunset, into a new life, Victor Hugo kills them both. And it sort of feels like, okay, I get your idea of being crushed by tyranny, these two innocent individuals, but reading this, it's like, it's a bit much, Victor. Bit much. A lot of people don't like the ending. A lot of people don't like the ending. Also, in the book, he talks and 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 talks. And so much. And he gives a big speech in the House of Lords that upsets everybody. I think that for me personally, the fact that Gwynplaine hardly ever talks, and silent films, people do talk to each other, and one of the things that people like to do in silent films was to lip read what were people saying, because not everything comes up on the title cards. But Conrad Veidt literally couldn't talk in this costume. He could barely speak with the dentures in, and he also spoke mostly German. So he was in a position where he was forced to be in that silence that Gwynplaine has trouble express. I think Gwynplaine has trouble expressing. It makes sense that Dee and Ursus can understand him. I don't know that he doesn't speak to a lot of other people. He does speak in the House of Lords. And one of the other things that you also see from the House of Lords at point onwards in the film is that very strong emotion really distorts his face. You see at first, the big build up at the beginning, or the amount that you see at the beginning, where Gwynplaine is either sad or with Day, is because he's not so the emotions that he is expressing don't twist his face so badly. But once he is actually exerting big emotions, then you see another reaction. There is laughter when more or less his face is more at rest, but you also see once he's really agitated with big emotion, then you see how badly what has been done to his face distorts him, and how ugly that has actually rendered him. But by that point in the film, you are, if you're with him, you're like, yes, you have to find this. So you are in the position that Day is in. You are on his side. But I think it is interesting how the fact that people confuse this as a monster is really interesting. I also think the fact that this is a 1920s film, this is 10 years after the First World War, 10 years after a period where men came back with very severe facial injuries that probably would have killed them earlier, but they had survived, and early plastic surgery was able to reconstruct to a degree, not brilliantly, not perfectly, and these men were treated poorly. And this film really asks empathy of somebody who doesn't look like you. It's like, oh, well, you know, it asks you to look behind that and see how isolating that would happen. Nobody signed up for the war to have their face ripped apart. Nobody thought that was going to happen. This was not something, nobody signs up for a war. They might think they might die, but I think the really catastrophically awful injuries that happened during the First World War, no one signed up thinking that was going to happen. And then they came back into civilian life and they were treated as monsters. Which is why I do not want to call this a horror film or Gwynplaine a monster, because it feels like an insult to the men who did come back, who were also treated as monsters. It actually, this film works because it asks this enormous amount of empathy. The early, it didn't do terribly well as a film, and part of that was there was no handsome leading man, because the Hunchback of Notre Dame has a handsome leading man. The Phantom of the Opera has a handsome leading man. The monsters in that, and I will say that the Phantom of the Opera is a monster. He kills people. He's a monster. The Hunchback of Notre Dame is sort of like Quasimodo, is sort of in a Gwynplaine type mode, but that makes sense because it's Victor Hugo. Really, the monster of Notre Dame is the Archbishop. I don't know how they made that thing into a children's cartoon. I mean, I've watched it, but it's like, I think the horny bishop is kind of like on the edge in terms of like this thing being appropriate for children. Also, the fact that like everyone ended up dead at the end of that book. Victor Hugo, I'm sensing a pattern. It is a story that asks you to empathize with someone who looks very, very different to you. The same way that about 50 years later, David Lynch will ask you to empathize with John Merrick. And that film also has an actor who, yeah, sure, you could rely on that makeup to do all that performance for you. But John Hurt's an excellent actor, and John Hurt doesn't do that. And John Hurt made me cry 3 times in that film. And I don't cry in films, but the combination of John Hurt's performance and the fact that this was a real man made me cry 3 times watching that film. So, but it is that kind of a, I think you would call The Man Who Laughs a horror film, only if you call The Man Who Laughs a horror film, you have to call The Elephant Man a horror film too. And The Elephant Man is most definitely not a horror film, ergo this is not a horror film. There is a 2012 remake or version of this that was a French film. I think that's more book accurate. But this being a silent film, you strip it back a lot. A lot of the political stuff has been stripped back out of it. It's not about a tyrant. What it is about a man who essentially has to find his dignity and worth in a very trying circumstance. It is asking an audience to reflect on how they react to people who look different. So it's probably not a film for everybody. I do like this, but I'm going to say it is sentimental. I would say it's not so much melodrama as sentimental, and I would say sentimental in terms of like using that 18th century term sentiment, which is, a very over-the-top form of empathy. I would say it is a sentimental film. I don't think that's a bad thing, personally. I think that there are much worse examples of sentiment and the sentimental, but it's definitely on top. It's like it is you either go into this and fully commit and just go, I'm going to go with it, or you're going to resist it and go, no, this is too much for me. Either ways, it's okay, but it's worth a look. It's worth a look. So yeah, it is probably one of my favorite silent films. I'm not going to say probably, it is one of my favorite silent films. It is one of the best Veidt performances, especially as he was an actor who seemed to really specialize in weird or villainous or villainously weird characters. And so this one is definitely in the weird characters, but he's not a villain, and is probably of his most famous roles, it's the only one where he's not a villain. His most famous roles, of course, being Casablanca and as Caesar in the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. So, yeah, it's very different from either of those. It's very different from pretty much everything. The only thing I can actually really think that it's similar to is the Elephant Man. That's the only thing where I've seen a very similar sort of character. And so, yeah, I think if you want to go with it, if you're willing to watch something very sentimental, yeah, try it out. But it is not horror. It's not horror, because if it's horror, then he has to be a monster, and he's not a monster. He's also the inspo for the Joker, which is, I think, the other place where that horror gets confused in. But if anyone was the Joker, the Joker may have got Gwynplaine's face, but he got Barkilphedro's character far more. So, that is The Man Who Laughs. I have babbled on long enough. This is going to take a bit of editing. Anyway, I will probably be a while before I'm back. I don't think we plan on missing out on books that much. But anyway, until then, auf Wiedersehen. If you would like to support this channel, come across to the Black Cockie Press website, www.blackcockiepress.com.au, where you will find books and other writing services to help with your writing.